There's nothing quite like losing the love of your life to teach you how empty a house can feel. For 12 long winters, Jedediah Rourke carried the weight of his wife Annie's absence like a stone in his chest. The townsfolk said her family ranch was cursed. They whispered about a blood feud and warned him to stay away. But grief has its own pull, and one evening Jed found himself riding back to the place he'd sworn never to visit. The Windvine Ranch looked dead. Weeds choked the fence posts. The house sagged under years of neglect. But when Jed stepped through the gate, Annie's old rocking chair was moving on the porch. There wasn't any wind. Her sewing kit sat open beside it. Inside the house, the hearth was still warm. What was waiting for him in that abandoned ranch house? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jedediah Rourke had always been a man of simple pleasures and honest work. At 67, his hands bore the calluses of 4 decades spent working timber in the Montana wilderness, and his weathered face told stories of seasons lived close to the bone. The lines around his eyes deepened when he smiled, which happened less frequently since Annie's passing, but when it did, it carried the warmth of a man who'd known genuine contentment. His cabin sat nestled in a grove of towering pines, 15 miles from the nearest neighbor. It was the kind of place where a man could hear his own thoughts without the world interfering. Annie had loved it here too, especially in the mornings when the mist rose off Clearwater Creek and painted everything in silver light. She'd sit on their porch with her coffee, humming old hymns while she watched the deer come down to drink. Those mornings felt like a lifetime ago now. The townspeople of Cedar Falls knew Jed as a quiet man who kept to himself, paid his bills on time, and never caused trouble. He'd come into Henley's general store once a month for supplies, exchange pleasantries about the weather or the fishing, and disappear back into the mountains. Mrs. Henley, who'd known every soul in Cedar Falls for 40 years, often remarked that Jed carried his grief like a gentleman, with dignity and without complaint. But grief, as Jed had learned, was a patient companion. It didn't rage or demand attention. Instead, it settled into the quiet spaces of a man's life, filling the silence where laughter used to live. It whispered in the mornings when he made coffee for 1 instead of 2, and it echoed in the evenings when there was no one to share the day's small victories or disappointments. Annie Weatherby had been the daughter of the most powerful ranching family in the valley when Jed first laid eyes on her. She was 19, with auburn hair that caught sunlight like spun copper and eyes the color of spring clover. He was 25, working seasonal logging jobs and saving every penny to buy his own piece of land. The Weatherbys owned 30,000 acres of prime grazing land, cattle that numbered in the thousands, and a reputation that stretched clear to the state capital. Jed had no business courting a Weatherby girl, and everyone knew it. The first time he saw her was at the annual Cedar Falls Harvest Festival. She was serving apple cider at the church booth, laughing at something old Pastor Mackenzie had said. When their eyes met across that crowded fairground, Jed felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that ran deeper than reason. She smiled at him, not the polite smile she gave everyone else, but something warmer, more curious. "You're the logger who works up on Granite Ridge," she said when he finally worked up the courage to approach her booth. "Yes, ma'am." Jedediah Rourke. He removed his hat, suddenly conscious of his work clothes and calloused hands. "Annie Weatherby." She poured him a cup of cider, their fingers brushing as he took it. "I've seen you at church, but you always sit in the back and leave before anyone can say hello. I reckon I'm not much for crowds." "Neither am I. Most of the time." She leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Want to know a secret? I've been watching you too." That conversation led to a walk around the festival grounds, which led to another meeting the following Sunday after church, which led to stolen moments whenever their paths could cross. Annie would ride out to check on the cattle in the high pastures, and Jed would happen to be working nearby. They'd talk for hours about everything and nothing, her dreams of traveling beyond the valley, his plans for building a homestead, the books they'd read, the places they'd like to see. Her father, Harrison Weatherby, was a stern man who'd built his empire through shrewd business deals and an iron will. When he discovered his daughter's attachment to the mountain logger, his reaction was swift and brutal. He forbade Annie from seeing Jed again, threatened to ruin any employer who gave Jed work, and made it clear that a union between a Weatherby and a man of Jed's station would never be tolerated. But love, as Jed learned, was stronger than social expectations or family pressure. Annie defied her father's wishes, meeting Jed in secret, planning a future that seemed impossible to everyone but them. They were married by Pastor Mackenzie in a simple ceremony attended only by a handful of witnesses who promised to keep their secret until the couple could find a way to make Harrison accept their union, the reconciliation. With the Weatherby family came slowly, grudgingly, but it came. Harrison, for all his pride and bluster, loved his daughter more than his prejudices. When Annie made it clear that her choice was final, he chose his daughter over his stubbornness. It helped that Jed proved himself to be a man of character, working harder than any three men to build a life worthy of Annie's faith in him. By the time Annie's younger brother Thomas took over the day-to-day operations of the ranch, Jed had become something close to family. Not the son-in-law Harrison had envisioned for his daughter, perhaps, but a man who loved Annie with a devotion that was impossible to question. The Windvine Ranch, where Annie had grown up, was a different matter entirely. It had belonged to her mother's family, the Thornfields, for 3 generations before Annie inherited it. Smaller than the main Weatherby spread, but rich in history and sentiment. It sat in a secluded valley 10 miles south of Cedar Falls. The house itself was a rambling 2-story structure built from local stone and timber, with a wraparound porch that caught the morning sun and windows that framed the surrounding mountains like living paintings. Annie had planned to restore the old place, to make it a retreat where she and Jed could spend their later years. She'd drawn up plans, collected furniture and fixtures, even started a garden. But life, as it often does, had other plans. A fever took her during the bitter winter of her 61st year. Swift and merciless, despite all the prayers and doctoring in the world. After the funeral, Jed couldn't bring himself to set foot on the Windvine property. The grief was too raw, the memories too painful. He told himself he'd deal with it later, when the hurt wasn't so sharp. But months turned to years, and the ranch sat empty, slowly surrendering to time and weather. The townspeople, never ones to let a good mystery go unexplored, began to whisper about the abandoned place. They spoke of strange lights seen in the windows on moonless nights, of voices carried on the wind when there was no one there to speak. Some claimed the old blood feud between the Thornfields and the Mackenzie clan, a violent dispute over water rights that had claimed several lives 50 years earlier, had left the land tainted with unrest. Jed had dismissed such talk as small-town superstition, the kind of stories that grew like weeds in places where not much happened. But as he stood now on his own porch, looking out at the mountains that hid the Windvine Valley from view, he found himself wondering if grief could leave its own kind of mark on a place. The decision to visit the ranch hadn't been a conscious one. He'd been riding his horse, Sam, along the old logging trails, as was his habit on quiet afternoons. The path had branched toward the Windvine Valley, and instead of turning back as he always did, Jed had let Sam choose the direction. The horse, perhaps sensing his master's need, had carried him steadily toward the place where so many memories waited. As they approached the ranch, the familiar landmarks stirred something deep in Jed's chest. The twin pine trees that marked the entrance to the valley, now grown thick with age. The creek that wound alongside the road, still singing its eternal song. The distant outline of the house itself, smaller than memory had painted it, but unmistakably home to the woman he'd loved more than life itself. And then there was the chair, rocking gently in the gathering dusk, as if Annie had just stepped inside to fetch her shawl and would return any moment to continue. Watching the sun set behind the mountains, the sight of that rocking chair moving without a breath of wind should have sent Jed riding. back to his cabin as fast as Sam could carry him. Any sensible man would have chalked it up to a trick of the evening light and never looked back. But grief has a way of making a man hunger for impossibilities, and Jed found himself dismounting at the rusted gate, his hands trembling as he worked the old latch. The metal protested with a groan that seemed to echo through the valley. Sam snorted nervously, pawing at the ground, but Jed whispered soothing words and led him through. The horse's unease was palpable, ears flicking constantly. Nostrils flared, as if scenting something that didn't belong. The path to the house was overgrown with wild grass and volunteer saplings, but Jed's boots remembered the way. Each step stirred memories that rose like dust in his wake. Annie walking this same path in her yellow summer dress, her hand in his as they planned their future together. Annie carrying wildflowers she'd picked from the meadow beyond the barn. Annie laughing at something he'd said, her voice carrying on the evening breeze like music. The rocking chair continued its gentle motion as he approached the porch. It was exactly as Annie had left it, weathered pine with a faded blue cushion she'd sewn herself. Her sewing basket sat beside it, lid slightly ajar, as if she'd been interrupted in the middle of mending. Through the open lid, Jed could see spools of thread in colors she'd favored. Deep burgundy, forest green, the soft yellow of spring butter. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his heart hammering against his ribs. The rational part of his mind offered explanations, a loose floorboard creating an imbalance, settling foundations, anything but what his eyes were telling him. But the chair kept rocking with the steady rhythm of someone lost in peaceful thought, and no amount of reasoning could explain away what he was witnessing. Annie. The word escaped his lips before he could stop it, barely a whisper, but loud enough to break the evening's stillness. The chair stopped. For a moment that stretched like eternity, nothing moved. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then slowly the chair began to rock again, but differently now, deliberately, as if acknowledging his presence. Jed's knees nearly buckled. 67 years of mountain living had taught him to trust his senses, to read the language of weather and wildlife, and the 1,000 small signs that kept a man alive in the wilderness. Those same instincts were screaming at him now, not in warning, but in recognition. Something familiar waited in this place, something that knew him as well as he knew himself. He climbed the porch steps slowly, each board creaking under his weight with sounds he remembered from a dozen visits in happier times. The front door stood slightly ajar, darkness visible beyond the threshold. The brass doorknob, green with age and weather, turned easily under his touch. The interior of the house hit him like a physical blow. Despite 12 years of abandonment, everything was exactly as Annie had left it. The stone hearth dominated the far wall, and impossibly embers glowed among the ashes. Not a roaring fire, but the kind of warmth that lingered when someone had banked the coals for the night. The air should have been musty with disuse, thick with dust and the smell of decay. Instead, it carried the faint scent of lavender and beeswax, the same fragrance that had always clung to Annie's hair. Jed stepped inside, his breathing shallow and quick. The main room stretched before him in the gathering darkness, furniture draped in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. But details emerged that made no sense. A teacup sat on the mantelpiece, still warm to the touch when he brushed it with trembling fingers. An oil lamp on the side table flickered with a steady flame, though no one had been here to light it. On the dining table, a letter lay open beside a fountain pen, the ink still wet. Jed recognized Annie's careful handwriting immediately, but the words made his blood run cold. "My dearest Jed, if you are reading this, then you have finally found the courage to come home. I have been waiting for you, as I promised I would. There are things you need to know, secrets I carried to my grave because I thought I was protecting you. But some truths cannot stay buried forever." His hands shook as he lifted the letter, scanning the words that seemed impossible yet undeniably real. The paper was cream-colored stationery Annie had favored, slightly rough to the touch. And the ink was the deep blue she'd always used for important correspondence. The Thornfield-Mackenzie feud was not what people believed. My great-grandfather Ezra Thornfield discovered something on this land, something valuable enough to kill for. The Mackenzies knew about it too, and they wanted their share. But it wasn't gold or silver or water rights that started the blood between our families. It was something far more precious and far more dangerous. Jed sank into the chair at the head of the table, the same spot where he'd shared countless meals with Annie during their visits to the ranch. The letter continued in her familiar voice, though the words described events that had happened long before either of them was born. Ezra found documents hidden in these walls by the original homesteader, a man named Cornelius Black, who fled east after the Civil War. Black had been a Confederate officer who made off with something that didn't belong to him, something the government would have moved heaven and earth to recover. When Ezra discovered Black's secret, he made the mistake of confiding in his neighbor, Duncan Mackenzie. The fire in the hearth popped suddenly, sending sparks up the chimney. Jed startled, then forced himself to continue reading. Duncan wanted equal shares of whatever treasure Ezra had found. When Ezra refused, Duncan brought his sons and his brothers, and they tried to take the ranch by force. The violence that followed claimed 7 lives, including Ezra's. But before he died, Ezra hid Black's secret again, this time so well that 3 generations of Thornfields couldn't find it. I found it, Jed. 3 months before I died, I found what they all killed each other trying to possess. The letter ended there, but Jed could see more pages scattered across the table. As he reached for them, a sound from upstairs made him freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor above his head. The ceiling creaked with each step, and dust motes danced in the lamplight as the walker paced from room to room. Jed's mouth went dry. He called out, his voice hoarse with emotion and fear. "Annie, is that you?" The footsteps stopped directly overhead, in what he knew had been Annie's sewing room. For long moments, silence stretched through the house. Then came another sound, a music box playing a melody he recognized. It was Greensleeves, Annie's favorite song, the tune she'd hummed while working in her garden or mending clothes by the fireplace. The music drifted down through the floorboards like a remembered dream, each note crystal clear in the darkness. Jed rose from his chair, the letters still clutched in his hand, and moved toward the staircase. The banister was solid under his palm, worn smooth by generations of hands. The music continued to play, calling him upward like a siren's song. At the foot of the stairs, he paused. Every instinct told him he was standing at a threshold, that crossing it would change everything he thought he knew about life, death, and the woman he'd loved. But Annie's voice seemed to whisper in his ear, not words he could hear, but a feeling that enveloped him like a warm embrace. She was waiting for him, just as she'd always waited when he came home late from work or long trips to town. Jed placed his foot on the first step and began to climb, following the music toward whatever truth Annie had left for him to discover. Behind him, the letter on the table rustled in a breeze that touched nothing else, and the fire in the hearth burned a little brighter, as if welcoming him home at last. The stairs creaked familiar protests under Jed's weight as he climbed toward the haunting melody. Each step carried him deeper into a past he'd thought was buried with Annie. Yet the music box's delicate notes seemed to beckon him forward with an urgency that made his chest tight with emotion. At the top of the staircase, a narrow hallway stretched in both directions. Moonlight filtered through a window at the far end, casting everything in silver shadows that danced with each cloud that passed overhead. The music was coming from the door on his right, Annie's sewing room, where she'd spent countless hours creating quilts and mending clothes while humming softly to herself. The door stood slightly ajar, warm yellow light spilling through the crack. Jed pushed it open slowly, his heart hammering so hard he wondered if it might simply stop from the strain. The room was exactly as Annie had left it. But more than that, it was as if she'd just stepped out for a moment. Her sewing machine sat ready for use, a half-finished quilt spread across the work table. The pattern was one he'd never seen before, intricate and beautiful, with pieces that seemed to tell a story in fabric and thread. But it was the music box on the windowsill that held his attention, its tiny ballerina spinning slowly as the melody played. He recognized the music box immediately. It had been Annie's mother's, then her grandmother's before that. Annie had treasured it, winding it every evening before bed, saying the music helped her sleep peacefully. Jed had packed it away with her other precious things after the funeral, storing everything in the cedar chest at the foot of their bed. He was certain it was still there, locked away with his grief, yet here it was, playing its gentle song as if 12 years hadn't passed. Jed moved closer to the work table, drawn by the unfinished quilt. The pattern was unlike anything Annie had ever attempted, complex geometric shapes that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them. But woven throughout the design were symbols he'd never seen before, sewn in metallic thread that caught the lamplight. They looked almost like a map, with arrows and markers that pointed toward. A soft sound from behind made him turn. In the corner of the room, Annie's rocking chair, different from the one on the porch, smaller and more delicate, was moving gently back and forth. But this time, Jed could see the faint impression of someone sitting in it, a shimmer in the air that suggested the outline of a familiar figure. "Annie?" His voice came out as barely a whisper. The rocking stopped. For a moment, the impression in the chair seemed to solidify, and Jed could swear he saw her, the curve of her cheek, the way she tilted her head when she was listening carefully. Then the image faded, leaving only empty air and the lingering scent of lavender, but the music box continued to play. And now Jed noticed something else. Next to it on the windowsill was a small brass key, old and tarnished with age. Attached to it was a piece of paper with a single word written in Annie's handwriting: cellar. Jed's blood chilled. The ranch had a root cellar, carved into the hillside behind the kitchen. Annie had rarely gone down there, saying it felt too closed in, too dark. In all their visits to the ranch, he couldn't remember her ever mentioning it, except to complain about the dampness that crept up through the floorboards. He picked up the key, surprised by its weight. It was warm to the touch, as if someone had been holding it moments before. The metal was etched with symbols similar to those in the quilt, intricate designs that seemed to move in his peripheral vision. The music box wound down slowly, the melody fading to silence. In the quiet that followed, Jed heard something that made his skin crawl, voices, distant and muffled, coming from somewhere beneath the house. They rose and fell like conversation, though he couldn't make out individual words. The sound carried an urgency that made him think of arguments, of heated discussions that couldn't wait for daylight. Jed left the sewing room and made his way back downstairs, the brass key clutched in his fist. The voices grew louder as he approached the kitchen, definitely coming from below ground. The entrance to the root cellar was through a heavy wooden door next to the pantry, secured with an iron lock that looked far newer than anything else in the house. The key fit perfectly. The lock opened with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the silent kitchen. Beyond the door, wooden steps descended into darkness that seemed to swallow his lamplight. The voices had stopped the moment he'd inserted the key, as if whatever was down there had suddenly become aware of his presence. Jed hesitated at the threshold. Every rational thought in his head screamed at him to leave, to mount Sam and ride back to his cabin and forget any of this had happened. But Annie's letter was still in his pocket, and the warmth of that brass key in his palm felt like a trust she'd placed in him. She'd said she'd been waiting for him, that there were things he needed to know. He descended the steps slowly, the lamplight pushing back the darkness one step at a time. The cellar was larger than he'd expected, carved deep into the hillside with stone walls that wept moisture in the lamplight. Wooden shelves lined the walls, most empty now except for a few forgotten jars of preserves and some old farming tools. But at the far end of the cellar, where the shadows were deepest, Jed could see something that didn't belong. A newer section of wall, the stones a slightly different color than the rest. And built into that wall was a metal door, small and square like a safe or strongbox, but much larger. As he approached, details became clearer. The door was made of steel, heavy and imposing, with a combination lock that gleamed silver in the lamplight. Above it, carved into the stone, were more of those strange symbols, along with initials, CB 1865 Cornelius Black. The Confederate officer Annie had mentioned in her letter. Jed set the lamp on a nearby shelf and examined the combination lock. 3 dials, each marked with numbers from 0 to 9. He had no idea what the combination might be, but as he studied the carved symbols above the door, a memory stirred. Annie's birthday, May 15th. She'd been born in 1925, but what if he tried 515, the month and day? Nothing. Then he remembered something else from the letter. 7 people had died in the feud. He tried 777. Still nothing. The voices returned then, no longer muffled but clear, as if people were standing right behind him. Jed spun around, nearly knocking over the lamp, but the cellar was empty. Yet he could hear them distinctly now. Men's voices, angry and desperate, speaking words that chilled him to the bone. He's hidden it again, the stubborn fool. Tear the place apart if you have to. It's here somewhere. 7 men dead for a secret that should have made us all rich. The Thornfield girl knows something. She's been coming here, digging around. Jed realized with growing horror that he was hearing echoes of the past, voices of the dead, replaying conversations from decades ago. But one voice rose above the others, clearer and more urgent than the rest. It was Annie's voice, and she was speaking directly to him. The date I found it, Jed. The day I discovered the truth. You remember? You were in town buying supplies for the cabin repairs. I called you that evening, so excited I could barely speak. Memory flooded back. 3 months before Annie died, she'd called him from the ranch, breathless with excitement about something she'd found in her grandmother's papers. She'd made him promise to come see her discovery the next day, but a late spring storm had kept him away. And by the time he'd made it to the ranch, she'd seemed different, secretive, almost frightened. The date was burned into his memory because it was the last time he'd heard genuine joy in her voice. March 8th, 38-something. But what year? When had she found it? The year before she died. 2010. With trembling fingers, Jed turned the dials. 380. The lock clicked open. The steel door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a space just large enough for a man to crawl inside. And there, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string, was a bundle that had waited over a century for someone to claim it. Jed reached into the hidden compartment with hands that shook like autumn leaves. The oilcloth bundle was heavier than expected, solid and rectangular beneath the protective wrapping. As he lifted it out, the voices in the cellar fell silent, as if whatever spirits haunted this place were holding their breath in anticipation. Back at the kitchen table, with the oil lamp casting dancing shadows on the walls, Jed carefully unwrapped the bundle. Layer after layer of oilcloth peeled away, revealing a wooden box underneath. Polished mahogany, with brass corners and a small brass nameplate that read, "Property of C.R. Black, Richmond, Virginia." Inside the box, Jed discovered a collection that made his breath catch. There were documents, dozens of them, some bearing official seals of the Confederate States of America. Maps drawn on fine paper showed railroad lines and river routes throughout the South. But it was the leather portfolio at the bottom of the box that drew his attention most. The portfolio contained correspondence, meticulously organized and dated, between Cornelius Black and various Confederate officials. As Jed read by lamplight, a story emerged that was far more complex than Annie's letter had suggested. Black hadn't been a common deserter or thief. He'd been a Confederate intelligence officer, tasked with moving gold reserves north as Union forces closed in on Richmond. The letters detailed a plan to establish secret supply lines and funding for Confederate sympathizers after the war. But something had gone wrong. In the final letter, dated April 1865, Black wrote to his commanding officer about unforeseen complications and the necessity of securing the assets until circumstances permit their proper disposition. At the bottom of the portfolio was a map, unlike any of the others. This one showed the Montana Territory, with detailed markings of the Windvine Valley and surrounding areas. X's marked specific locations with notations in a code that used the same symbols Jed had seen, carved above the safe. But it was the letter tucked behind the map that made Jed's heart race. Written in Annie's familiar handwriting, it was dated just 2 weeks before her death. "My dearest Jed," it began, "if you are reading this, then my worst fears have come true, and I am no longer able to protect you from the truth I discovered. The Confederate gold that Cornelius Black hid in our valley was never lost. It was deliberately kept secret by people who understood its true value." Jed set the letter down, his mind reeling. Confederate gold, hidden somewhere on the ranch property. The blood feud between the Thornfields and Mackenzies hadn't been about pride or water rights. It had been about treasure worth killing for. And somehow, Annie had figured it all out. He continued reading. "The gold isn't just valuable for its metal content. These particular coins were minted in Richmond during the final months of the war, and several are unique proof specimens that would be worth fortunes to collectors. But more importantly, they represent something that certain people would pay anything to keep hidden." A sound from upstairs interrupted his reading. Footsteps again, but different this time. Heavier, more deliberate. Multiple sets of feet moving through the rooms above, as if several people were searching for something. Jed grabbed the lamp and the letter, moving quietly toward the staircase. The footsteps stopped as soon as he reached the bottom step. Then, drifting down from the second floor, came the sound of voices, different from the angry spirits he'd heard in the cellar. These voices were calm, conversational, with the cadence of people who knew each other well. "She was getting too close, Harrison." "You know she was." Jed recognized the second voice immediately. Harrison Weatherby, Annie's father, dead these past 8 years. But he was speaking as if he was still alive, addressing someone Jed couldn't identify. "My daughter was a curious woman, Thomas. Perhaps too curious for her own good, Thomas." Annie's younger brother, who died in a ranching accident 5 years after Annie's passing. But here was his voice, clear as day, coming from the room that had been Annie's bedroom. Jed climbed the stairs slowly, drawn by a need to understand what was happening in this place, where time seemed to fold back on itself. The bedroom door was closed, but light seeped out around the edges, and the voices continued their conversation with an urgency that suggested long-delayed words finally being spoken. "She found the location, didn't she?" This was a third voice, one Jed didn't recognize, but that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "She found more than that," Thomas replied. "She found the records. Black's correspondence with our great-grandfather. She knew the whole family had been protecting the secret for generations, and now she's told her husband, that mountain man who thinks he can solve mysteries that have stayed buried for 60 years. Jed pressed his ear to the door, his heart hammering. They were talking about him, about Annie's decision to leave him clues to find the truth. "Jedediah Rourke is a good man," Harrison's voice said firmly. "If Annie trusted him with this knowledge, then perhaps it's time the truth came to light." "The truth?" The unknown voice laughed bitterly. "The truth is that our families have spent 4 generations protecting something that could destroy us all if it became public knowledge. The gold is the least of our worries." "What do you mean?" Thomas asked. "Black wasn't just moving Confederate gold north, boy. He was moving evidence. Documents that proved certain prominent Union families were secretly funding both sides of the war. Names that are still powerful today, families whose fortunes were built on that blood money. If those documents surface—" "They won't," Harrison interrupted. "Annie made sure of that. She hid the most dangerous materials where no one would think to look." Jed straightened, his mind racing. There were more secrets, more hidden caches that Annie had prepared for him to find. But where? And what kind of documents could still be dangerous after more than a century and a half? The voices began to fade, as if the speakers were moving away from the door. Jed tried the handle, but it wouldn't turn. Through the keyhole, he could see only darkness, though moments before there had been light and the clear sound of conversation. He returned to the kitchen and Annie's letter, reading with new urgency. The final paragraphs revealed locations, a series of hiding places Annie had prepared throughout the ranch property. But she'd encoded the information using references only Jed would understand. The spot where they'd shared their first kiss, the tree where they'd carved their initials, the place where they'd planned to build a small cabin for their retirement years. Each location was described in terms of their shared memories, a treasure map written in the language of love. But as Jed studied the clues, he realized Annie had been clever in ways that went beyond sentiment. She'd scattered the evidence across multiple locations, ensuring that even if someone found one cache, they wouldn't have the complete picture. At the bottom of the letter was a warning that made his blood run cold. Trust no one completely, my darling. Even among our friends and family, there are those who would kill to keep these secrets buried. The Thornfield-Mackenzie feud may have ended 60 years ago, but the interests that started it are still very much alive. Outside, Sam whinnied nervously, and Jed heard the sound of other horses approaching through the darkness. Multiple riders, moving quietly but not quietly enough to escape the notice of a man who'd spent his life in the wilderness. Someone else knew he was here, and they were coming to the ranch with purposes he could only guess at. Jed quickly gathered the documents, stuffing them back into their oilcloth wrapping. The voices upstairs had spoken of people who would do anything to keep these secrets buried, and now it seemed those people had arrived. He had minutes, maybe less, before they reached the house. The sound of horses grew closer, and with it came the low murmur of men's voices discussing strategy. Jed blew out the lamp, plunging the kitchen into darkness, and moved toward the back door. Whatever Annie had started, whatever truth she'd died protecting, it was now his responsibility to see it through. But first, he had to survive the night. Jed slipped out the back door of the ranch house, the oilcloth bundle tucked securely under his arm. The night air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and clouds drifted across the moon, providing intermittent cover as he made his way toward the barn where Sam waited. Behind him, the sound of approaching horses grew louder, accompanied by low voices that carried an edge of dangerous intent. He reached Sam just as the riders came into view around the front of the house, 3 men on horseback, moving with the careful precision of people who'd done this kind of work before. In the moonlight, Jed could make out their silhouettes, but not their faces. One dismounted and approached the front porch, while the other 2 positioned themselves to watch the surrounding area. "House is dark," the first man called softly. "But there's a horse here. Someone's been inside recently." "Check the cellar," another voice replied. "If the old man found what we think he found, that's where it would be." Jed's blood chilled. They knew about the hidden safe, knew he'd been there, but how? And who were these men who moved through the darkness like they owned it? Sam nickered softly, and Jed laid a calming hand on the horse's neck. They needed to leave, but the direct route back to the main road would take them past the intruders. Instead, Jed led Sam quietly toward the old logging trail that wound up through the timber behind the ranch. It was rough going in the dark, but it would take them home without being seen. As they climbed the hillside, Jed caught fragments of conversation drifting up from the ranch below. The men were inside now, moving through the house with the efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were looking for. "Cellar's been opened." "Safe's empty." "Then he's got them." The old documents, maybe more. Orders were clear. No witnesses, no evidence. The last words hit Jed like a physical blow. These weren't treasure hunters or curious locals. They were killers, sent by someone who understood exactly what Annie had hidden and would do anything to keep it secret. The voices from upstairs had been right. There were still living people with interests worth killing for. Jed urged Sam faster up the narrow trail, but the old horse was struggling in the darkness, stumbling on loose rocks and fallen branches. Behind them, Jed could hear the searchers spreading out, their voices growing fainter, but more urgent. "Trail leads up the mountain. He can't have gotten far. Take the logging road. Circle around and cut him off." They knew the area well enough to predict his route. That meant local knowledge, people familiar with the valley and its history. But who in Cedar Falls would know about Confederate gold and century-old secrets? And who would have the resources to send armed men in the middle of the night? The trail leveled out as they reached the ridge that separated the Windvine Valley from Jed's own property. Here Sam could move faster, but they were also more exposed to anyone watching from below. Jed pushed the horse harder, driven by an urgency that went beyond mere self-preservation. Annie had trusted him with these secrets, and he wouldn't let her down by getting himself killed before he could understand what she'd discovered. As they descended toward his cabin, Jed's mind raced through the implications of what he'd learned. The Confederate gold was real, hidden somewhere on the ranch property, according to Annie's coded directions. But the documents were potentially more dangerous, evidence of Civil War profiteering that could destroy reputations and fortunes even today. The question was what to do with the knowledge. Take it to the authorities? But which authorities could be trusted? The men hunting him had moved with military precision and local knowledge that suggested connections reaching deep into the community's power structure. Jed's cabin came into view through the trees, dark and welcoming in its familiar solitude. But as he approached, something felt wrong. Sam's ears flicked nervously, and the horse shied away from the front porch, where shadows seemed deeper than they should be. "Easy, boy," Jed whispered, but his own nerves were on edge. He dismounted and led Sam around to the back of the cabin, where a small lean-to provided shelter. The bundle of documents went with him as he approached his home cautiously, every instinct screaming that he wasn't alone. The front door stood slightly ajar, though Jed was certain he'd latched it securely before riding to the ranch. Moonlight filtering through the cabin windows revealed furniture that had been moved, searched, then hastily repositioned. Someone had been here looking for something, and they might still be inside. Jed circled the cabin slowly, checking each window and doorway. The building was small enough that there weren't many places to hide, but a man with a gun could do a lot of damage from concealment. At the back window, he could see into his main room clearly enough to confirm it was empty, but the bedroom and root cellar remained hidden from view. He decided on boldness over caution. Moving to the front door, he called out in a voice that carried across the clearing. "I know you're in there. Come out and we'll talk like civilized men." Silence stretched for long moments. Then from the darkness inside the cabin came a voice that made Jed's heart skip a beat. "Hello, Jed." It was Annie's voice, as clear and warm as if she were standing right beside him. But the tone carried sadness that cut through him like a knife. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," she continued. "I tried to protect you from all of this, but some secrets are too big to stay buried forever." Jed pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The cabin was empty of living people, but Annie's presence filled the space like a gentle warmth. He could see her now, not clearly, but as a shimmer in the air near the fireplace, translucent and beautiful and heartbreakingly familiar. "Annie," his voice cracked with emotion. "How is this possible?" "Love, Jed. Love is stronger than death, stronger than time. I've been waiting here for you, knowing that someday you'd find the courage to visit the ranch and discover what I left for you." She moved closer, and though he couldn't quite touch her, he could feel her presence like a whisper against his skin. "But they followed you, didn't they? The people who killed me." The words hit him like lightning. "Killed you?" "Annie, you died of fever. I was there. I held your hand. The fever was real, but it wasn't natural." Her voice carried an anger he'd never heard in life. "They poisoned me, Jed. Slowly, carefully, making it look like illness. Because I'd gotten too close to the truth, asked too many questions about Black's treasure and what it really represented." Jed sank into his chair, the oilcloth bundle still clutched against his chest. Everything he'd believed about Annie's death, everything he'd mourned for 12 years, had been a lie. She'd been murdered for the secrets she'd uncovered, and he'd never even suspected. "Who?" The word came out as a growl. "Who killed you?" "People with more money and power than you can imagine. Families whose fortunes were built on Civil War profiteering, who've spent generations covering their tracks. The Weatherby Ranch was never the real target. It was always the Windvine, because that's where Black hid the evidence that could destroy them." Outside, the sound of horses approaching made them both turn toward the windows. The riders had found his trail, and they were coming to finish what they'd started at the ranch. "They're here," Annie whispered, her form beginning to fade. "Hide the documents, Jed. Don't let them get the evidence. And remember, not everyone is who they seem. Some of our oldest friends have been protecting these secrets for longer than you know." Her image flickered like a candle in the wind, leaving Jed alone in his cabin as armed men surrounded his home. But her words echoed in his mind, giving him strength and purpose he hadn't felt since the day she died. Annie had been murdered, and her killers were outside his door. But she'd left him the tools to expose the truth if he was brave enough to see it through. The time for grief and passive acceptance was over. Now it was time for justice. Jed moved quickly through his cabin, guided by decades of familiarity with every board and beam. The documents needed to be hidden somewhere the searchers wouldn't think to look. Somewhere that would protect Annie's evidence, even if they tore the place apart. Behind the stone fireplace, Jed had built a small cache years ago, a hiding place for emergency supplies and the few valuables he owned. It was accessible only by removing specific stones in a pattern that looked accidental, but was actually carefully designed. He worked by feel in the darkness, placing the oilcloth bundle deep within the cavity before replacing the stones. Outside, voices grew closer as the riders positioned themselves around the cabin. Through the front window, Jed could see the glow of a torch moving through the trees, and he caught fragments of conversation that confirmed his worst fears. "Surround the place. He's trapped now. Remember, it has to look like an accident. Old Mountain Man lived alone, cabin fire got out of hand. What about the documents? Search first, burn after? No one will question a tragedy that removes a problem and destroys evidence at the same time. They plan to kill him and burn down everything he'd built with Annie." The casual brutality in their voices told him these men had done this before, probably more than once. How many people had died to protect whatever secrets Cornelius Black had hidden in the Montana wilderness? A knock at the front door interrupted his thoughts. Polite, almost friendly, the kind of knock a neighbor might make when stopping by for coffee. "Mr. Rourke." "This is Sheriff Davidson." "We need to talk." Jed's blood turned to ice. Tom Davidson had been sheriff of Cedar Falls for 8 years, a man Jed had known and trusted, someone who'd attended Annie's funeral and offered genuine condolences. If Davidson was involved in this conspiracy, then the corruption ran deeper than Annie had imagined. "Come on out, Jed," Davidson continued, his voice carrying the authority of his office. "We know you were at the Windvine tonight. We found your tracks, saw the disturbed cellar. You've stumbled into something bigger than you understand." Jed remained silent, his mind racing through options. The cabin had a back door, but they'd surely have it covered. The root cellar had a tunnel that connected to a hunting blind 50 yards away, an escape route he'd built during his more paranoid years in case of emergencies exactly like this one. "I'm disappointed in you." "Jed," Davidson called out, "Annie would be ashamed to see you digging up old secrets that are better left buried." She understood the importance of letting sleeping dogs lie. The mention of Annie sparked a rage in Jed that burned away his fear. This man who'd sat at their table and eaten Annie's cooking, who'd mourned at her graveside with apparent sincerity, had been part of the conspiracy that killed her. "She trusted you," Jed called back, his voice carrying across the clearing. "She considered you a friend." "I was her friend," Davidson replied, and for a moment his voice carried what sounded like genuine regret. "That's why I tried to warn her away from her investigations. I told her repeatedly that some family histories were better left alone. But she wouldn't listen, so you killed her." A long pause. When Davidson spoke again, his voice had hardened. "Annie's death was a mercy, Jed. If she'd continued down the path she was on, exposing secrets that protect important people, the consequences would have been far worse. For her, for you, for everyone she cared about, what secrets could be worth murdering an innocent woman?" "Innocent?" Davidson laughed bitterly. "Annie discovered documents that would have destroyed some of the most powerful families in the country. Do you have any idea what happens to people who threaten that kind of wealth and influence? They don't just die, Jed, they disappear. Their loved ones disappear. Everyone who ever knew them disappears. Through the back window, Jed could see figures moving in the darkness, men positioning themselves to prevent his escape. But they didn't know about the tunnel, didn't know he'd spent years preparing for scenarios where his military training might be needed again. The Confederate gold was never the real treasure, Davidson continued, apparently hoping to draw Jed into a longer conversation. Black was carrying something far more valuable. Records of northern industrialists who were selling weapons and supplies to both sides during the war. Names, dates, amounts, bank transfers. Evidence that some of America's most respected family fortunes were built on blood money. That was over a century ago, Jed called back. Why does it matter now? Because those families are still around, still powerful, still wealthy beyond measure. Political dynasties, industrial empires, financial institutions, all built on foundations that would crumble if the truth came out. The reputation damage alone would cost billions. The legal implications could destroy entire corporate structures. Jed was moving as Davidson talked, slipping into the root cellar through a concealed entrance in the cabin's floor. The tunnel was narrow and dark, carved through earth and stone during long winter evenings when he'd had nothing better to do than prepare for. Threats that seemed unlikely at the time. Your wife thought she could expose the truth and somehow avoid the consequences. Davidson's voice continued, muffled now by earth and timber. She believed in justice, in doing the right thing regardless of the cost. It was admirable and incredibly naive. The tunnel emerged inside the hunting blind, a small structure camouflaged to look like a fallen tree. From here, Jed could see his cabin surrounded by men with rifles, torches ready to set his home ablaze once they'd confirmed he was dead. Davidson stood on the front porch, still talking to the empty building, as if Jed might emerge peacefully. But Jed wasn't planning to run. These men had killed the woman he loved, destroyed 12 years of his life with their lies, and now they planned to burn down everything he'd built in her memory. Running would solve nothing and honor no one. Instead, he began to circle around behind them, moving through the forest with skills learned in decades of hunting and a war most people had forgotten. If they wanted a fight, he'd give them one. But first, he needed to understand exactly who he was fighting and why. Through the trees, he could see Davidson checking his watch, growing impatient with the lack of response from inside the cabin. The sheriff gestured to his men, and 2 of them moved toward the back door, while another prepared to break down the front. "Time's up, Jed," Davidson called out. "We're coming in." The men kicked in both doors simultaneously, rushing inside with military precision. Shouts echoed through the night as they searched the empty rooms, growing increasingly agitated when they found no trace of their target. "He's gone." "Check the cellar!" "Find that tunnel. Every mountain man has an escape route." But by then, Jed was already in position behind a massive pine tree, close enough to hear their conversations, but hidden by shadows and terrain. What he learned in the next few minutes would change everything he thought. He knew about Annie's death and the conspiracy that had claimed her. "Life, boss isn't going to like this," one of the men said as they regrouped outside the cabin. "Boss doesn't have to know," Davidson replied. "We torched the place, report that Rourke died in an accidental fire, and claim the documents were destroyed in the blaze. What if he already hid them somewhere else? Then we tear apart every inch of this property until we find them. And if that doesn't work, we start pressuring his friends, his acquaintances, anyone who might know where he'd go to ground." Davidson pulled out a cell phone, checking for signals. "The important thing is that we control the narrative. As far as the outside world knows, Jedediah Rourke was a grieving widower who finally snapped and burned down his own home. Tragic, but not uncommon for isolated mountain folk. As Jed listened to them plan his murder with the casual efficiency of men who'd done this before, a cold fury settled in his chest. These weren't just corrupt officials or treasure hunters, they were professional killers working for people with resources and connections that reached far beyond Cedar Falls, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated a man who'd spent his entire life in these mountains, who knew every trail and hiding place for 50 miles in any direction. And they'd given him a reason to fight that went beyond mere survival. Annie's murder would be avenged, her evidence would see the light of day, and these men would face justice for their crimes. Even if it cost him his life, Jed would make sure the truth came out. The war for Annie's legacy had begun. From his concealed position, Jed watched Davidson's men torch his cabin. The flames caught quickly, fed by decades of seasoned timber and memories that now turned to smoke and ash. But as he witnessed the destruction of his home, something else was happening that made his blood run cold. The fire wasn't just destroying his property, it was illuminating the surrounding forest. And in that dancing orange light, Jed could see more men than Davidson had brought. Figures moved through the trees in a coordinated pattern that spoke of military training and careful planning. This wasn't a hastily organized cover-up. This was a full-scale operation involving dozens of people. As if reading his thoughts, Davidson spoke into his phone. Phase 1 complete. Target's location unknown, but contained within the operational area. Initiate Phase 2. The response came through clearly in the night air, a voice Jed recognized with shock that nearly made him cry out, "Roger that, Tom. We're moving into position now. Remember, no one leaves this valley alive. Who knows what Rourke discovered tonight?" It was Thomas Henley, son of the general store owner, a man Jed had known since Thomas was a boy. But the voice on the radio carried the authority of someone commanding a significant operation, someone with resources far beyond what a small-town shopkeeper should possess. "Thomas, you copy," Davidson continued. "We need to assume he's got the documents with him. Full sweep, standard grid pattern, no survivors. Understood. Team 2 is moving into the Windvine Valley to secure the ranch. Team 3 has the main road blocked. He's not getting out of here." Jed's mind reeled as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. This wasn't just Davidson and a few corrupt officials. This was an organized network that had infiltrated the entire community. How many people in Cedar Falls were part of this? How long had they been watching him, planning for the night he might discover Annie's secrets? But the biggest shock was yet to come. As the teams coordinated their movements, another voice joined the radio chatter, and this one stopped Jed's heart entirely. "All teams, this is command. Be advised that we have civilian complications. Pastor Mackenzie is en route to the Rourke property with 2 church members. Intercept and contain." The voice belonged to Annie's brother, Thomas Weatherby, the man who'd supposedly died in a ranching accident 5 years earlier. But here he was, very much alive, commanding an operation designed to kill Jed and destroy any evidence of the conspiracy that had claimed Annie's life. Everything Jed thought he knew about the past 12 years crumbled in an instant. Thomas Weatherby's death had been faked. His funeral, an elaborate deception designed to remove him from suspicion while he coordinated the cover-up of his sister's murder. The grief Jed had shared with the Weatherby family, the comfort they'd given each other in their mutual loss, all of it had been a lie through his earpiece. Thomas continued giving orders with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. "Davidson, I want a complete search of the Rourke property. If those documents are hidden there, find them. Henley, coordinate with the state contacts. We need this area declared a crime scene and sealed off for at least 48 hours. "What about the pastor?" Davidson asked. "Mackenzie doesn't know anything useful, but we can't risk him talking about what he might see here tonight." "Standard automobile accident protocol. Make it look like he lost control on the mountain road." Jed's hands clenched into fists. Pastor Mackenzie had officiated at his wedding to Annie, had provided comfort during her final illness, had been a genuine friend for more than 20 years. Now they planned to murder him simply because he'd chosen the wrong night to check on a grieving parishioner. But Mackenzie's approach also represented an opportunity. The pastor knew these mountains almost as well as Jed did, and if he could be warned in time, he might provide the ally Jed desperately needed. 2 men who knew the terrain could potentially outmaneuver even a well-organized search party. Moving carefully through the forest, Jed began working his way toward the main road, where Mackenzie would likely approach. But as he moved, fragments of radio chatter revealed the true scope of what Annie had discovered and why so many people were willing to kill to keep it hidden. Confirm that all documents relating to the Brennan Industrial Group are secured, Thomas ordered. Affirmative. Nothing traces back to the current corporate structure. What about the banking records? Those are the priority. If the Rothschild connections become public, we're looking at international complications. Jed paused behind a fallen log, pieces of a massive puzzle clicking into place. The Brennan Industrial Group was one of the largest defense contractors in the country, a company that had grown from Civil War-era arms manufacturing into a modern military-industrial giant. The Rothschilds were international banking royalty, their financial empire spanning continents and centuries. Annie had stumbled onto evidence that connected these powerful entities to Civil War profiteering, and that evidence was apparently detailed enough to threaten their modern operations. No wonder they were willing to commit murder to keep it hidden. Team leader to all units, Thomas's voice crackled through the night. Be advised, the target may have additional intelligence beyond the black documents. Annie Rourke was investigating connections between historical and contemporary operations. Assume he knows about Project Lazarus. Project Lazarus. Jed had never heard the name before, but the way Thomas spoke, it suggested something ongoing, something that made the historical documents seem minor by comparison. What had Annie discovered that went beyond Civil War secrets? A new voice joined the radio traffic, older and carrying the weight of absolute authority. This is Control. Thomas, report status. Situation is fluid but contained, sir. Target escaped initial contact, but remains within the operational area. Documents are believed to be hidden but recoverable. Time frame? 6 hours maximum. We have full local cooperation and state resources standing by. Acceptable. But Thomas, this ends tonight. Your sister caused enough problems when she was alive. Her husband will not have the opportunity to continue her work. The callous dismissal of Annie's life sparked a rage in Jed that burned away his fear and doubt. These people had murdered his wife and were now discussing her like she'd been a minor inconvenience. They'd manipulated him for 12 years, letting him grieve for a woman they'd killed while planning to eventually murder him too. But they'd also revealed something crucial. Thomas Weatherby was taking orders from someone else, someone with even more authority and resources. Annie's investigation had reached beyond local corruption to touch interests that operated on a national or international level. Through the trees ahead, Jed could see headlights approaching on the mountain road. Pastor Mackenzie's old pickup truck, moving slowly through the darkness toward what its driver didn't know was an ambush. Jed had minutes to intercept him before Davidson's men could carry out their automobile accident. As he moved toward the road, Jed's mind was already working on a plan that went beyond simple survival. If Annie had discovered connections between Civil War profiteering and modern corporate interests, if Project Lazarus represented ongoing criminal activity, then her evidence was more than just historical curiosity. It was a weapon that could bring down powerful people who thought themselves untouchable. But first, he had to save Mackenzie and find a way to retrieve the documents from his cabin's hiding place. The fire would die down eventually, and Davidson's men would search the ruins thoroughly. Jed needed to get back there before they found Annie's evidence. The war for truth was escalating, but Jed was no longer fighting alone. He had an ally coming down the mountain road, and somewhere in the ashes of his former life, he had ammunition that could destroy the people who'd taken everything from him. It was time to turn the hunters into the hunted. Jed reached the mountain road just as Pastor Mackenzie's headlights swept around the final curve. The old pickup truck moved slowly, carefully navigating the narrow gravel path that wound through the forest toward Jed's property. Behind those headlights sat a man who had no idea he was driving toward his own execution. Moving quickly but quietly, Jed positioned himself where the road curved sharply around a massive boulder, a spot where Mackenzie would have to slow down even more. As the truck approached, Jed stepped into the headlight beams, hands raised to show he was unarmed. The pickup lurched to a stop, and Mackenzie rolled down his window. At 73, the pastor was still an imposing figure, tall and lean with white hair and the kind of steady eyes that had comforted hundreds of parishioners through their darkest hours. "Jed, what in heaven's name are you doing out here? I saw the fire from town." Mackenzie's words died as he took in Jed's appearance, soot-stained, wild-eyed, carrying the look of a man who'd seen too much in too short a time. "Pastor, we need to get out of here right now," Jed said urgently, moving to the passenger side of the truck. "They're planning to kill you. Make it look like an accident on this mountain road." Mackenzie's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, then a hardening resolve that spoke to his years of ministering in a rough country where violence was never far beneath the surface. "Get in," he said simply. As Jed climbed into the cab, Mackenzie was already turning the truck around in the narrow space, using techniques that suggested he'd done emergency evacuations before. "Who's they, and why would anyone want to hurt me?" "It's a long story, but," Jed began, then stopped as radio chatter crackled from Mackenzie's CB radio. The pastor had always monitored emergency frequencies as part of his unofficial role as the community's crisis counselor. "Unit 7 to command," a voice reported. "Target vehicle is stopped at checkpoint Alpha. 2 occupants visible." Mackenzie and Jed exchanged glances. "They were already being watched." "Pastor," Jed said quietly, "I need you to trust me completely. Everything you thought you knew about Annie's death, about the people running this town, about your own safety, it's all been a lie." Mackenzie nodded grimly and accelerated down the mountain road. But instead of heading toward town, he took a sharp turn onto a logging trail that Jed hadn't even noticed. "I've suspected something wasn't right in Cedar Falls for years," the pastor said. "Too many convenient accidents, too many people leaving town suddenly, too many questions that nobody wanted answered." The logging trail was rough and narrow, barely wide enough for the pickup truck, but Mackenzie navigated it with the confidence of someone who'd explored every back road in the county. Behind them, Jed could see other headlights following, but the pursuit vehicles were having trouble matching Mackenzie's pace on the challenging terrain. "Where are we going?" Jed asked. "Somewhere they can't follow easily. Old mining camp about 5 miles up this trail. Been abandoned since the 50s, but the buildings are still solid. We can hole up there while you tell me what's really going on." As they bounced and lurched through the forest, Jed quickly outlined what he'd discovered at the ranch: Annie's letter, the hidden documents, the conspiracy that reached from Civil War profiteering to modern corporate interests. Mackenzie listened without interruption, his face growing graver with each revelation. "Project Lazarus," Mackenzie repeated when Jed mentioned the name. "I've heard that before. A few years back, there was a federal investigation into defense contract irregularities. Something about weapons being sold to foreign governments without proper authorization. The investigation was suddenly dropped, and the lead investigator transferred to Alaska. You think it's connected? In a place like Cedar Falls, everything's connected eventually." Mackenzie guided the truck around a washout that would have stopped most vehicles. "The question is how deep this goes and who we can trust to help us expose it." The mining camp appeared in their headlights like a ghost town, frozen in time. Several wooden buildings clustered around what had once been the main operation, most still standing despite decades of weather and neglect. Mackenzie parked the truck inside a large equipment shed and killed the engine. In the sudden silence, they could hear pursuit vehicles in the distance, engines straining as drivers tried to follow their route through increasingly difficult terrain. But the sounds were growing fainter, suggesting that the immediate chase had been abandoned in favor of setting up roadblocks and search patterns. "They'll wait us out," Jed said. "Block all the roads, search every building in the county if they have to. Maybe, but we've got something they don't." Mackenzie smiled grimly. "We've got the truth and we've got God on our side. In my experience, that's usually enough." Despite everything, Jed found himself almost smiling. Mackenzie's faith had always been practical rather than theoretical, the kind of belief that showed itself in action rather than words. If anyone could help him turn the tables on this conspiracy, it would be the man who'd spent 50 years fighting for justice in a place where justice often came hard. "What do you need from me?" Mackenzie asked. Jed thought carefully. The documents were hidden in his cabin, but the building was now a pile of ash and ember watched by armed men. However, Annie's letter had mentioned multiple hiding places, locations scattered across the ranch property that only Jed would recognize from their shared memories. "I need to get back to the Windvine Ranch," Jed said. "Annie hid evidence in several places there, but I'll need time to find them without getting shot. That can be arranged." "What else?" "We need to contact someone outside the local power structure. Someone who can't be bought or threatened into silence." Mackenzie nodded thoughtfully. "I've got a contact at the FBI field office in Billings, Agent Sarah Chen. She's been investigating corruption in rural law enforcement for the past 2 years. Specifically, she's been looking into cases where local officials might be protecting illegal activities. Can we trust her? I officiated at her wedding 3 years ago. Her husband's a good man, and she's got the kind of integrity that doesn't bend under pressure. If anyone can help us, it's Sarah." The sound of helicopters in the distance made them both look up. Through gaps in the shed's roof, they could see searchlights sweeping through the forest, methodical and thorough. "They're escalating," Jed observed, "which means we're on the right track. People don't call in helicopters for small-time corruption." Mackenzie pulled out an old satellite phone, the kind used by emergency services in remote areas. "Sarah needs to know what we've discovered, but more importantly, we need to get those documents to her before they can be destroyed or discredited." As Mackenzie worked to establish contact with Agent Chen, Jed studied the layout of the mining camp. The buildings were positioned to take advantage of natural defensive features, rocky outcroppings that provided cover, multiple escape routes through the surrounding forest, elevated positions that would give them sight lines on anyone approaching. If they had to make a stand here, they could probably hold out for several hours against a ground assault. But helicopters changed the equation dramatically, and the longer they delayed, the more resources their enemies could bring to bear. "Pastor," Jed said quietly, "I need you to understand something. These people killed Annie because she threatened their secrets. They'll kill both of us without hesitation if they think we're going to expose Project Lazarus and the other crimes they're covering up." Mackenzie looked up from the satellite phone, his eyes reflecting the calm certainty that had sustained him through decades of ministering to people in crisis. "Jed, I've been preparing for this fight my whole life. Maybe not this specific battle, but the war between truth and lies, between justice and corruption, between ordinary people and those who think power gives them the right to do whatever they please." The satellite phone crackled to life, and a woman's voice came through clearly, despite the distance and atmospheric interference. "Agent Chen here. Pastor Mackenzie, I wasn't expecting to hear from you at this hour. Sarah, we've got a situation that requires immediate federal intervention. Murder, conspiracy, evidence of ongoing criminal activity involving government contracts and international arms dealing." A pause. Then, "Pastor, I need you to be very careful about what you say over this channel. Are you in immediate danger?" "Yes. And we've got evidence that could bring down people with significant resources and political connections." "Location?" Mackenzie gave her coordinates for the mining camp, then added, "We're going to attempt evidence recovery at the Windvine Ranch in approximately 2 hours. If you don't hear from us by dawn, assume we're dead and that everything we've discovered dies with us." "Understood. Federal resources are en route to your location. ETA, approximately 90 minutes. Can you hold out that long?" Jed looked out at the forest where helicopters circled like mechanical vultures and searchlights probed every shadow. "In 90 minutes, a lot could happen, but they'd come too far to give up now." "We'll be here," Mackenzie replied. "But Sarah, come ready for a fight. These people have already proven they'll kill to protect their secrets." As the satellite phone went silent, Jed felt something he hadn't experienced since Annie's death. hope. For 12 years, he'd lived with grief and questions that seemed to have no answers. Now finally, he had the chance to get justice for the woman he'd loved and expose the conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives. The final battle was about to begin. The helicopters passed overhead twice more before moving on to search other areas, their searchlights probing the forest like mechanical eyes hunting for prey. Jed and Mackenzie used the lull to prepare for what they both knew would be their most dangerous hour, returning to the Windvine Ranch to recover Annie's hidden evidence. Before federal help could arrive, they'll be watching the ranch, Mackenzie said as they checked their supplies. Probably have it locked down tighter than a bank vault. Maybe, but they don't know the property like I do. Jed studied a hand-drawn map he'd sketched from memory, marking the locations Annie had encoded in her letter. There's a game trail that approaches from the north, follows Clearwater Creek through a ravine they can't see from the house. Used to take that route when I was courting Annie and didn't want her father to know I was visiting. Mackenzie smiled despite their grim circumstances. Some skills from a man's younger days prove useful in unexpected ways. They left the mining camp on foot, moving through forest that Jed knew as well as the rooms of his burned cabin. The night was crisp and clear, with enough moonlight to navigate by, but not so much that they'd be easily spotted by watchers. Behind them, the glow from Jed's destroyed home was still visible through the trees, a reminder of how much had already been lost to this conspiracy. The approach to the ranch took them down into Clearwater Creek's ravine, where the sound of moving water would mask their footsteps, and the steep banks would provide concealment from anyone watching the main approaches. As they moved closer to the property, Jed could see lights positioned around the house and barn, not the random illumination of searchers, but the methodical placement of security perimeters, professional setup, Mackenzie observed quietly. Military or law enforcement training? Both, probably. Thomas has been planning this for years. Jed felt a familiar anger, burning in his chest at the thought of Annie's brother coordinating her murder while comforting the family at her funeral. They reached the first of Annie's hiding places just as the church bell in Cedar Falls chimed. Midnight, a sound that carried clearly through the mountain air and reminded them how isolated they were from any immediate help. The location was a lightning-struck oak tree where Jed had carved their initials during one of their secret meetings 40 years earlier. The carved letters were barely visible now, weathered and grown over with bark, but Jed's fingers found them easily in the darkness, according to Annie's coded directions. She'd hidden something in a metal box buried 3 feet north of the tree at the base of a distinctive boulder. Working by feel, Jed and Mackenzie dug carefully with tools Mackenzie had brought from his truck. The soil was soft from recent rains, and within minutes they'd uncovered a waterproof container about the size of a cigar box. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, showing documents that Annie had apparently discovered and photographed before returning them to their hiding places. The images showed correspondence between Civil War-era industrialists and Confederate agents, bank records documenting payments to both Union and Confederate suppliers, and shipping manifests that proved weapons and supplies had been sold to both sides of the conflict. But more disturbing were the modern documents mixed in with the historical ones. Corporate filings showing how Civil War-era companies had evolved into modern defense contractors. Financial records proving that families who'd profited from wartime suffering had parlayed that wealth into contemporary political influence. And most damning of all, evidence that Project Lazarus was a modern continuation of the same illegal arms dealing that had started during the Civil War. Jesus, Mackenzie whispered as he examined the photographs by flashlight. This isn't just historical corruption. It's ongoing criminal enterprise spanning 5 generations. A sound from the direction of the house made them both freeze, voices growing louder as a patrol moved through the trees nearby. Jed quickly repacked the photographs and led Mackenzie deeper into the ravine, following the creek toward the second hiding place Annie had described. This location was more dangerous, closer to the house, near the spot where Annie's garden had once bloomed, with vegetables and flowers she'd tended with such care. But it was also where she'd hidden the most important evidence, the documents that would prove Project Lazarus wasn't just arms dealing, but something far more sinister. As they approached the garden area, Jed could see that Davidson's men had been busy. The ground around the house had been churned up by systematic searching, and several areas showed signs of recent excavation. They'd found some of Annie's hiding places, but apparently not all of them. The second cache was buried beneath what had once been Annie's rose garden, in a spot she'd described as where the yellow roses remember our first dance. Jed knew exactly what she meant, a particular rose bush she'd planted to commemorate their wedding day. Positioned so she could see it from the kitchen window while she worked, the rose bush was gone now, probably trampled during the searches, but Jed's memory of the garden's layout was precise enough to locate the right spot. This container was larger, buried deeper, and when they opened it, both men understood immediately why Annie had been murdered. The documents inside proved that Project Lazarus wasn't just about illegal arms sales, it was about deliberately creating international conflicts to justify increased defense spending. The conspiracy involved defense contractors, government officials, and foreign agents working together to start wars for profit. Annie had discovered evidence of weapons being sold to terrorist organizations, of false flag operations designed to justify military interventions, of American officials coordinating with foreign enemies to create crises that would benefit the military-industrial complex. "This is treason," Mackenzie said, his voice barely a whisper. "Not just corruption or profiteering, actual treason against the United States." Before Jed could respond, spotlights blazed to life around them, turning night into harsh, artificial day. They were surrounded, caught in the open with nowhere to run and evidence that powerful people would kill to suppress. "Don't move," Davidson's voice boomed through a bullhorn. "You're surrounded by federal agents conducting a lawful investigation." The lie was so audacious that Jed almost laughed. These weren't federal agents, they were private. Military contractors and corrupt officials working to protect a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and industry, but as armed figures emerged from concealment around the garden, Jed realized that the truth of their identity mattered less than the reality of their situation. He and Mackenzie were outnumbered at least 10-1. Caught in open ground with no cover and no escape routes. "Jedediah Rourke," another voice called out, and Jed's blood chilled as he recognized Thomas Weatherby stepping into the light. Annie's brother looked older than his supposed age at death, but there was no mistaking the family resemblance or the cold calculation in his eyes. "Hello, Jed. I wish we could have avoided this confrontation, but you forced our hand by refusing to leave the past buried where it belongs." The past. Jed stood slowly, his hands visible but not raised in surrender. "You killed your own sister. You let me grieve for 12 years while you covered up her murder. And you call that the past?" Thomas stepped closer, flanked by armed men who moved with military precision. Annie was always too curious for her own good. Even as children, she couldn't leave mysteries alone. When she started investigating the family history, asking questions about great-grandfather's business dealings, we tried to redirect her interests. But she kept digging. "So you poisoned her?" We gave her opportunities to stop. Multiple warnings, chances to walk away from dangerous knowledge. She chose to continue, knowing the risks. Mackenzie spoke up, his voice carrying the moral authority of decades spent fighting for justice. "No knowledge is worth murdering an innocent woman. No secret is worth betraying your own family." Thomas turned his attention to the pastor, and something flickered in his expression. Regret, perhaps, or recognition of a line he'd crossed long ago and could never uncross. Pastor Mackenzie, "I'm sorry you got involved in this. If you'd stayed home tonight, you could have lived out your remaining years in peaceful ignorance." "Ignorance isn't peace," Mackenzie replied firmly. "It's just delayed justice." The sound of approaching helicopters made everyone look up. But these weren't the search helicopters from earlier. These were larger military transport birds, approaching fast and low. And from the reaction of Thomas's men, these weren't reinforcements they'd been expecting. "Sir," one of the contractors called out urgently, "we've got incoming federal assets. Multiple aircraft, unknown strength." Thomas spoke rapidly into his radio. "Control, this is Field Leader. Request immediate extraction. Federal intervention imminent." The response crackled back with barely controlled panic. "Negative on extraction. Abort operation and scatter." "Repeat, abort and scatter. This operation is burned." Thomas stared at the radio in disbelief, then at Jed and Mackenzie with a mixture of rage and resignation. "You've destroyed something that took generations to build." "Good," Jed replied simply. The helicopters were directly overhead now, and spotlights even brighter than the ground units were illuminating the entire area. Over loudspeakers, a woman's voice echoed across the valley. "This is FBI agent Sarah Chen. You are surrounded by federal agents. Lay down your weapons and surrender immediately." The arrival of federal agents changed everything in an instant. Thomas's contractors, faced with the choice between a hopeless firefight against federal forces or surrender, began lowering their weapons and stepping back from their positions. But Thomas himself seemed to undergo a different transformation, the mask of civilized authority falling, a way to reveal something desperate and dangerous. "Underneath, you don't understand what you've done," he said to Jed, his voice carrying an edge of hysteria. "This conspiracy you're so eager to expose, it's protected American interests for over a century. The profits from our operations have funded intelligence gathering, covert operations, and strategic initiatives that kept this country safe. By starting wars," Mackenzie demanded, "by selling weapons to terrorists, by being realistic about how the world actually works." Thomas snapped back. "Democracy is a luxury that requires strong defense industries and foreign intelligence networks. Project Lazarus ensured that America always had the resources and information needed to protect our way of life." Agent Chen's voice echoed from the helicopters again. "Mr. Weatherby, this is your final warning. Surrender immediately or face the consequences." Thomas pulled out a radio detonator, holding it where everyone could see. "Agent Chen, I suggest you reconsider your position. There are explosive charges placed throughout this valley, enough to level the ranch house. Destroy all the evidence your friends have recovered, and eliminate anyone within a half-mile radius." Jed felt his blood turn to ice. Thomas was threatening to destroy not just the evidence, but everyone present, including his own men. The conspiracy had driven him so far beyond normal human reasoning that mass murder seemed like an acceptable solution. "Thomas," Jed said carefully, "your sister wouldn't want this. Annie believed in truth, in justice, in doing what was right regardless of the cost. This isn't what she would have chosen. My sister was naive." Thomas shouted, his composure finally cracking completely. She thought she could expose century-old secrets without consequences, that justice was more important than stability. She never understood that some truths are too dangerous to be revealed. Or maybe she understood that some lies are too dangerous to be maintained. Mackenzie replied quietly. The standoff stretched for long moments, with federal agents positioned around the perimeter, but unable to act without risking massive casualties. Thomas's finger hovered over the detonator while his contractors watched nervously, clearly having second thoughts about following a man who'd progressed from corruption to potential mass murder. Then, cutting through the tension like a voice from beyond the grave, came a sound that made everyone freeze. Annie's voice, clear and strong, carried on the night wind from the direction of the ranch house. "Thomas, put down that detonator, please." Thomas spun toward the house, his face going white with shock. There, standing on the front porch in a pool of ethereal light, was Annie Weatherby Rourke. She looked exactly as she had in life, but translucent, shimmering like heat waves rising from summer pavement. "Annie?" Thomas whispered, his hand trembling so badly the detonator nearly slipped from his grip. "I've been watching you, little brother. Watching what you became after my death, what choices you made in the name of protecting family secrets." Her voice carried sadness that seemed to echo through the entire valley. "This isn't protection, it's destruction. You've become the very thing our family fought against. You don't understand," Thomas said desperately. "I did it for you, for the family, for—" "You did it for fear," Annie interrupted gently. "Fear of consequences, fear of change, fear of admitting that our family's wealth was built on blood money. But Thomas, some prices are too high to pay, even for security." Jed watched in amazement as Annie's spirit walked slowly down from the porch, approaching her brother with the same loving patience she'd shown him in life when he'd made childish mistakes. But this was no childish mistake. This was evil chosen deliberately and maintained for years. "The documents Jed found tonight will expose everything," Annie continued. "Project Lazarus, the historical profiteering, the modern treason, all of it. You can choose to let that happen peacefully, or you can choose to add mass murder to your crimes. But either way, the truth is coming out." Thomas looked around wildly, seeing federal agents positioned throughout the area, his own men backing away from him, and his sister's ghost standing just 10 feet away with infinite compassion in her eyes. The weight of his choices, the enormity of his crimes, seemed to settle on him all at once. "I can't go to prison, Annie. I can't face what I've done." "Yes, you can," she replied firmly. "You can choose to be brave now at the end, even if you couldn't choose it before. You can help Jed expose the truth completely, help the federal agents understand how deep this conspiracy goes. You can finally do something that would make me proud to call you my brother." The detonator slipped from Thomas's fingers, falling to the ground with a soft thud that seemed to echo like thunder in the silence. He stood there for a moment, looking lost and broken, before slowly raising his hands in surrender. "Agent Chen," he called out in a voice barely above a whisper, "I surrender. I'll cooperate fully with your investigation." Federal agents moved in quickly, securing the detonator and taking Thomas into custody with professional efficiency. But as they led him away, he kept looking back at the spot where Annie had stood. Though her image had already begun to fade, "Jed," Annie's voice came one last time, speaking only to him now, "I'm so proud of you. You found the truth, you did what was right, and you honored our love by seeking justice rather than revenge." "Annie," Jed began, but she was already dissolving into the night air, leaving only the faintest scent of lavender and the warmth of a love that transcended death itself. Agent Chen approached Jed and Mackenzie, a professional demeanor softened by recognition of what they'd endured. "Mr. Rourke," Pastor Mackenzie, "I need you to know that what you've uncovered tonight is the breakthrough we've been working toward for years. The evidence you recovered will help us dismantle a conspiracy that reaches into multiple government agencies and major corporations." Jed nodded, still looking at the spot where Annie had appeared. "What happens now?" "Now we make sure this never happens again. The people responsible for your wife's murder, for Project Lazarus, for decades of corruption and treason, they're going to face justice, complete justice." As federal agents processed the crime scene and began the massive investigation that would follow, Jed felt something he hadn't experienced since Annie's death: peace. Not the peace of forgetting or moving on, but the peace of completion, of a promise kept and a wrong finally made right. The truth was out. Annie's murderers would face trial, and the conspiracy that had claimed so many lives was finally exposed. It wasn't the ending Jed would have chosen, but it was the ending Annie had died trying to achieve. Justice, at last, had been served. 6 months later, Jed stood on the newly rebuilt porch of the Windvine Ranch house, watching the sun set behind the mountains that had sheltered his love story with Annie for more than 4 decades. The federal investigation had concluded with indictments reaching from local officials like Sheriff Davidson all the way to corporate boardrooms in New York and Washington. Project Lazarus had been exposed as one of the largest and longest-running criminal conspiracies in American history, its tentacles reaching into defense contracts, foreign policy decisions, and international arms dealing spanning 5 generations. Thomas Weatherby, had kept his word, cooperating fully with federal investigators and providing details that helped unravel networks of corruption that might otherwise have remained hidden for decades longer. He would spend the rest of his life in federal prison, but his testimony had been crucial in bringing justice to the dozens of people who'd been murdered over the years to protect the conspiracy secrets. The ranch house had been restored using insurance, money and federal restitution funds, rebuilt exactly as Annie had planned it before her death. Every room reflected her vision, from the kitchen where she dreamed of cooking meals for visiting her grandchildren to the sewing room where she'd planned to finish the quilts that now told the story of her investigation. In fabric and thread, Pastor Mackenzie climbed the porch steps, moving more slowly than he had 6 months earlier, but with the satisfaction of a man who'd fought the good fight and won. "Evening, Jed. Beautiful sunset tonight." "Annie always said this was the perfect spot for watching the day end," Jed replied, settling into the rocking chair that no longer moved without wind but still carried the warmth of memories that would never fade. "Any regrets about staying here, instead of moving somewhere without so many difficult associations?" Jed considered the question as he had many times over the past months. "This is where our love story happened. The good parts and the tragic parts, the joy and the sorrow, it's all here. Moving away would feel like abandoning her twice." Mackenzie nodded, understanding the deep roots that tied a man to the places where his heart had learned to love. "And Annie? Do you still feel her presence?" "Sometimes, usually in the mornings when the mist rises off the creek, or in the evenings when the light falls just right across the meadow. But it's different now, peaceful, like she's finally at rest, knowing the truth came out." Agent Chen's investigation had revealed that Project Lazarus wasn't unique. Similar conspiracies had operated throughout American history, using military conflicts and international crises to generate profits for well-connected families and corporations. But Annie's evidence had provided the definitive proof needed to expose and prosecute the networks that had hidden behind patriotism and national security for generations. The trials would continue for years, but the immediate threat was over. The people who'd killed Annie, who'd threatened Mackenzie, who'd tried to bury the truth under violence and intimidation, were either dead, imprisoned, or fleeing prosecution in countries without extradition treaties. "I got a letter from Agent Chen yesterday," Jed said, pulling an envelope from his shirt pocket. "Thought you'd want to hear the latest." Mackenzie settled into the chair beside him as Jed read from the official FBI correspondence. "Mr. Rourke, I wanted to update you on the final prosecutions related to Project Lazarus. The Brennan Industrial Group has agreed to pay $2.4 billion in fines and restitution, with additional funds being used to establish the Annie Weatherby Rourke Foundation for government accountability. Your wife's sacrifice has not only brought justice to her killers, but has created lasting reforms that will help prevent similar conspiracies in the future. She would have liked that." Mackenzie said softly, "Annie always believed that good could come from even the worst tragedies if people were willing to work for justice." As darkness settled over the valley, Jed reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from a grieving widower, avoiding painful memories, to a man at peace with both love and loss. The truth about Annie's death had been devastating, but it had also been liberating. For 12 years, he'd carried guilt about not being able to save her from illness. Now he knew that her death hadn't been his failure. It had been murder committed by people who feared her courage and determination. "Do you think she knew?" Mackenzie asked, following Jed's thoughts with the intuition that came from decades of counseling people through grief. "When she was hiding all that evidence, leaving you clues to find the truth, do you think she knew she might not survive to see justice done?" Jed looked out at the mountains, where he'd first fallen in love with a rancher's daughter, who dreamed of changing the world through small acts of courage and kindness. "I think she knew the risks, but I also think she knew me well enough to understand that I'd eventually find the strength to finish what she started." The rocking chair creaked gently in the evening breeze, and for just a moment, Jed could swear he felt Annie's hand brush his shoulder with the familiar touch that had comforted him through 40 years of marriage. Love, he'd learned, wasn't diminished by death. It was refined by it, purified into something stronger than grief and more enduring than sorrow. "Thank you," he whispered to the gathering darkness, knowing that somehow, somewhere, Annie could hear him. "Thank you for trusting me with the truth. Thank you for believing I could see it through." The mountains held their peace, and the creek sang its eternal song, and Jedediah Rourke sat in his wife's favorite chair, finally at home in a place where love and justice had prevailed over corruption and fear. The past would always carry pain, but it also carried the promise that some things, truth, love, and the courage to fight for both, could never be destroyed by those who preferred darkness to light. Annie's legacy lived on, not just in the foundation that bore her name or the prosecutions that vindicated her sacrifice, but in the quiet certainty that sometimes, when good people refuse to accept injustice, the arc of the moral universe does indeed bend toward justice. The sun finished setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that reminded Jed of the evening 43 years earlier when a young logger had first dared to speak to a rancher's daughter at a harvest festival. Some stories, he realized, never really end. They just transform into something larger than their original telling, becoming part of the eternal human struggle between what is and what ought to be. In that transformation, Annie Weatherby Rourke had found her immortality, and Jedediah Rourke had found his peace.